As I write these final words, many years have passed since the events I have described. The war for Messenian independence continued for nearly 2 decades after my return from Athens, with victories and defeats, moments of hope and periods of despair that tested our resolve again and again. We never achieved the complete and permanent liberation that we had originally envisioned, but we established principles and precedents that continue to inspire resistance to tyranny throughout the Greek world. I eventually left the life of a warrior to become what I had never expected to be, a teacher and chronicler of our people's struggle. The skills I had learned from Xenophanes and the insights I had gained from my travels proved more valuable in the long term than my abilities with spear and sword. Through the school I established in a liberated Messenian city, I was able to pass on not just practical knowledge, but also the broader vision of human possibility that had sustained our resistance through its darkest moments. Many of the young people I taught went on to become leaders in their own communities, carrying forward the ideas and values we had fought to establish. Some became warriors in their own right, continuing the military struggle against Spartan oppression. Others became craftsmen, farmers, merchants, and scholars, building the economic and cultural foundations that any free society requires. A few became teachers themselves, ensuring that the lessons we had learned would not be forgotten by future generations. The boy who had once hidden under mats while his father was dragged away to be murdered had become a man capable of envisioning and helping to create new forms of human social organization. The transformation was not complete. No human transformation ever is, but it was real and substantial. More importantly, it was a transformation that could be replicated by others who found themselves in similar circumstances. The helot system that had seemed so permanent and overwhelming when I was young proved to be vulnerable to sustained resistance by people who refused to accept that their bondage was inevitable or justified. The Spartans, for all their military prowess and social discipline, could not maintain control over populations that had learned to see themselves as something other than natural slaves. But perhaps the most important lesson of our struggle was that freedom is not simply something that can be won through military victory or political revolution. True freedom requires the development of new ways of thinking about ourselves and our relationships with others. It requires the cultivation of virtues and capabilities that make self-governance possible. It requires, above all, the recognition that human beings possess inherent dignity and potential that no system of oppression can ultimately destroy. The story I've told is my own, but it is also the story of countless other individuals who have faced similar choices between submission and resistance, between accepting injustice and working to create better alternatives. Their names are mostly forgotten, their individual struggles unrecorded, but their collective efforts have shaped the world we inhabit. In remembering them, we honor not just their sacrifices but our own obligations to continue their work. The young helot who learned about his heroic ancestors from a blind singer, who discovered the power of education to transform lives, who witnessed the possibility of just governance in Athens, who helped to envision new forms of social organization based on principles of equality and dignity. That young man became the person writing these words, but he was not the endpoint of the transformation he experienced. He was simply one link in a chain of human development that stretches backward to the earliest ancestors and forward to descendants not yet born. To those who will read this account in times and places I cannot imagine, I offer both encouragement and warning. The specific circumstances you face will undoubtedly be different from those I encountered, but the fundamental choices will remain the same. You can accept injustice as inevitable, or you can work to create better alternatives. You can allow yourselves to be defined by the limitations others seek to impose on you, or you can discover and develop your own capabilities and potentials. The path of resistance is never easy, and success is never guaranteed. But the alternative, passive acceptance of conditions that deny human dignity and potential, is ultimately more costly than any struggle for justice could ever be. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, but the price of slavery is the gradual death of everything that makes life worth living. Choose wisely, and remember that your choices will shape not only your own destiny but the destinies of all those who come after you. My name is Procol, and I am what they call a helot. I was born into bondage on the banks of the rushing Eurotas River, in a village that exists only to serve Spartan masters. My story begins on the morning when I learned what it truly means to be enslaved. Though I had lived that reality every day of my 14 years without fully understanding its weight, I remember hiding beneath the rough mats in our small hut, my heart pounding like a trapped bird against my ribs. Through the gaps in the woven reeds, I watched as they led my father away. His name was Theron, and he had been the strongest man in our village, able to lift stones that took 3 other men to move. But on that morning, he walked with his head bowed like a bull being led to slaughter. The Spartan warriors who came for him were young, maybe only a few years older than myself. They wore red cloaks that seemed to absorb the morning light, and their bronze spear points caught the sun like deadly stars. Their faces showed no emotion, no hatred, no anger. Just the cold efficiency of men doing a job they had been trained for since childhood. This was what they called the Crypteia, the secret war that Sparta declared against us helots every year. My father could have fought them. He could have taken 2 or 3 of those young warriors with him into death. His hands, scarred from years of working the fields and forging iron, could have crushed windpipes and broken necks, but he knew what would happen if he resisted. They would burn our hut, and my mother and sisters would die screaming in the flames. So he walked quietly, accepting his fate to save us. I pressed my face against the rough mat and wept silently, knowing that I would never see my father again. In our village, we had learned not to speak of those who disappeared. Their bodies were sometimes found in the grove beyond the village or on the river bank, but we buried them without ceremony, like criminals. Only family members attended these silent funerals. It was as if the rest of the village had made an unspoken agreement to forget the dead, as if remembering them might bring the same fate upon ourselves. This had always been our way. Every spring, the Spartans came to our village and killed whoever they pleased. They never touched women or the elderly. They paid no attention to children. They chose only young, strong men, those who might someday find the courage to resist. For the young Spartans, this was a game, a rite of passage. They would hide in the fields and haystacks like wolf cubs, stalking their prey. At night, they would creep up to their victim's hut, killing him on the spot or dragging him away. This game was called Crypteia, and it marked the beginning of the sacred war that Sparta declared against us helots every year. I had long wondered why the Spartans attacked and killed our people, but no one could or would answer the questions that tormented me. It has always been this way, the old men would say with resignation. The Spartans have always killed whoever they wanted. Even thinking about a different life was considered a crime. My father had once told me a story that haunted me. The Spartans had offered freedom to any helot who could pay a small ransom, 3 sheep. Many people were eager to buy their freedom. The Spartans took their sheep, placed crowns on the heads of those who had paid as a sign of their liberation, and led them away. A few days later, these newly freed men were seen in the temples. After that, no one ever saw them again, and no one could explain how they had died. The year before, I had been lucky enough to visit the city where the Spartans lived. It was called Sparta. The houses where the Spartans lived were not much better than our hut. But Sparta was very different from our village in other ways. There was not a single fruit tree in the entire city, not a single patch of cultivated land, at least none that I could see. Why should the Spartans work the land or tend apple and pear trees when everything would be brought to them ready-made? Near a great oak tree in the center of Sparta, where the houses were roofed with tiles instead of straw, stood a long wooden table. Here, under the open sky, men and youths ate their meals, with their hair cut short and wearing identical high-belted cloaks. They ate their unchanging black broth and drank watered wine. They sang warlike hymns and discussed whom to attack or what tribute to take from the helots. They called the inhabitants of the surrounding villages helots. I was a helot too. So were my father and grandfather. Anyone born in the villages along the banks of the gurgling Eurotas who was not a Spartan was called a helot. What struck me most was that there were no more people in Sparta than in 3 or 4 villages. On the way to Sparta, I had passed through 7 villages, but there were other villages where helots lived. There were 10 times as many helots as Spartans. Perhaps that was why the Spartans killed the young and strong helots. After my father's death, I became the head of the family, though I was not yet 14 years old. Now I had to not only drive the sheep to pasture but also plow the land, thresh grain, and do other men's work. True, my father had brothers who could have helped, but they had their own families and their own worries. Most importantly, the villagers, even close relatives, were afraid to help each other. On that day that would forever change my understanding of who I was and who my people had once been, I was cutting grass in the meadow beyond our village. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat stung my eyes as I swung the crude iron sickle back and forth through the tough stems. My back ached from bending over, and my hands were raw from gripping the wooden handle. I had been working since before dawn, trying to gather enough fodder for a few remaining sheep before the heat of the day became unbearable. Exhausted, I lay down in the shade of a stunted olive tree to rest. That's when I heard it. A regular tapping sound, like a woodpecker drumming against a tree trunk. The sound came from the road that led through our village to the larger settlements beyond. I raised myself on one elbow and peered through the wavering heat toward the dusty path. A tall, gray-haired man was walking slowly along the road, carrying some kind of strange object at his side. In his right hand, he held a staff, which he extended in front of him, tapping the ground as if he were searching for the way forward. I realized immediately that he was blind. In our village, it was not customary to approach strange men, especially travelers. Strangers brought questions, and questions brought attention from the Spartans. But something about this man's careful, hesitant progress made me think he might lose his way and wander into the wilderness to die. I approached the blind man cautiously. Now that he was closer, I could see that he was an old man with a long gray beard that reached almost to his belt. The object hanging at his side was a lyre, its wooden frame polished smooth by countless hands, its strings gleaming like silver threads in the harsh sunlight. The old man heard my footsteps and stepped aside, startled. Something in his posture suggested fear, as if he had learned to expect violence from strangers. "It's just me, Procol," I said softly, trying to make my voice sound as unthreatening as possible. "Would you like me to guide you to the village?" "Come closer to me," the old man requested, his voice surprisingly strong and melodious for someone who seemed so frail. He placed his hand on my shoulder and quickly but gently ran his fingers across my face, reading my features with the sensitivity of someone who had long relied on touch to understand the world around him. His fingers were calloused from years of playing the lyre, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "I can see that you are a good boy," the old man said after a short pause. "You are not like those who threw stones at me. Do you see how my legs are wounded?" I looked down at his legs and gasped. They were covered in cuts and bruises. Dried blood caked on his shins and ankles where stones had struck him. Who would attack a blind old man? What kind of cruelty drove people to hurt someone who could not even see his attackers? "You must be a helot?" The old man asked as we approached our hut. "Everyone in our village is a helot," I replied, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. I seated the guest on the threshold of our hut and ran to fetch a clay bowl filled with water from our well. I set it at his feet, and the old man lowered his wounded legs into the cool water. For the first time since I had met him, an expression of relief and peace appeared on his stern, weary face. He understood that here he would not be mistreated, and that this night he would have a roof over his head. I invited the old man into our hut and offered him a small loaf of bread and a piece of sheep's cheese. These were almost the last of our provisions, but hospitality was sacred, even among the poorest helots. "Forgive me, but I have nothing else to offer you," I said, embarrassed by our poverty. "Ever since the Spartans killed my father, life has become very difficult for us." The old man took the lyre from his side and, settling himself more comfortably, accepted the food from my hands. "Not the dinner matters, but the welcome," he said, smiling for the first time since I had met him. After eating, the blind man turned to me with a serious expression. "I am poor. I don't even have a hut like this one, and my only wealth is my lyre and my songs. With these, I want to thank you for your kindness." The old man placed the lyre on his knees and gently ran his hand across the strings. The singer had a beautiful and strong voice, and the music that emerged from his instrument was unlike anything I had ever heard. I had never heard songs before, nor had the other villagers. Only Spartans had the right to sing. The songs they sang at their banquets praised strength and cruelty. They marched into battle singing warlike hymns. The measured cadence of the old man's words enchanted me completely. I sat motionless, with wide-open eyes, catching every sound. I didn't even notice how our hut gradually filled with people. Those who couldn't find room inside stood by the doorway, pressing close to hear every word. And the old man sang on and on. People listened, and many had tears streaming down their cheeks. They wept not because the song was sad. The old man sang of victorious battles, of joyful feasts, of beautiful women whose beauty dimmed the minds even of gods. The people wept because their own lives were so unlike the lives of the heroes in the songs. They remembered the dead, and for the first time, they thought about how their loved ones might have been saved if they had taken up swords to defend them. The old man continued to sing. He sang of golden Messenia and its mighty king Agamemnon, who conquered strong-walled Troy. He sang of the adventures of Odysseus, lord of Ithaca, and of his son Telemachus, who visited sandy Pylos. Not a word in his songs was there about Sparta. It was as if at the time when these songs were born, there were neither Spartans nor helots. There were only heroes and the great deeds they performed. When the old man finished, a long silence fell over the crowded hut. Finally, someone asked the singer, "Where is the city of Messenia? Where was Pylos? And the other cities from your song? Is all this just imagination?" "The gods have deprived me of sight," the old man replied, his voice heavy with sadness. "But the real blind ones are you. Have you not seen the giant hewn stones in the fields? Have you never dug painted pottery shards from the earth?" The helots nodded their heads. "Yes, we have seen giant stones, hewn by Cyclops, too heavy for even 10 men to lift. Yes, we have found bright shards, rusty swords and knives. We broke them and threw them into the Eurotas. We knew that the Spartans would kill anyone found with weapons. Blind you are, blind," the old singer said with sorrow. "Those stones are the remains of ancient cities. Near the Eurotas stood the city of Amyclae. Closer to the sea were Messenian Tyrans. These stones were not hewn by Cyclops, but by your ancestors. And they besieged Troy. You live in the land of your ancestors. Your land was the mother of heroes. Once warlike Dorians attacked you. They captured and plundered the cities. Many they killed and sold into slavery. And those who remained alive, they settled on the banks of the Eurotas and forced to pay tribute." "So you were singing about our ancestors?" I asked, my voice trembling with excitement and something I had never felt before, pride. "Yes, my boy," the old man replied, and in those simple words, my entire world shifted on its axis. I could not sleep. All night, I lay on my simple straw mat, staring up at the smoke-darkened rafters of our hut, thinking about my father and how he had died so meekly, like all the others before him. If only he had heard the old man's songs. If only he had known that his ancestors were heroes who had fought before the walls of Troy and sailed across wine-dark seas to distant lands, he would not have gone to his death submissively, like a sheep led to slaughter. And the others, if they had heard these songs earlier, would have come to help my father. They would not have let him be killed without a fight. The old man's words echoed in my mind like the tolling of a great bronze bell. We were not born to be slaves. We were the descendants of heroes, of warriors who had built cities with walls so massive that later generations thought only giants could have constructed them. The blood of Agamemnon's warriors flowed in our veins. We were the children of those who had sailed with Odysseus and fought beneath the towers of Troy. But what had become of us? How had we fallen so far from the glory of our ancestors? The old man had told us. The Dorians had come from the north like a plague of locusts, destroying everything in their path. They had overwhelmed our cities not through superior courage or wisdom, but through sheer numbers and savagery. They had torn down what had taken generations to build and enslaved those who survived their initial assault. And now their descendants, These Spartans continued the work their ancestors had begun. They kept us in ignorance of our heritage, forbidding us even to carry weapons or sing songs that might remind us of who we once were. They killed our strongest and bravest, generation after generation, ensuring that we would never again rise to challenge their rule. It was still dark when the old man rose to leave. Deprived of sight, he could not tell whether night still lasted or day had already begun. Quietly, he left our hut, his staff tapping against the packed earth as he made his way back to the road, and suddenly, I understood that I could no longer remain within these walls. I could not continue to work, so that others might profit from my labor. I could not wait until I grew up for the Spartans to kill me as they had killed my father. It pained me to think of leaving my mother and sisters, but I had to abandon them. The song had awakened something in me that could not be put back to sleep. It had shown me a different way to live, a way that honored the memory of our heroic ancestors. The old man had mentioned a place called Ithome, a high mountain somewhere beyond the river, not far from where sandy Pylos once stood, the city of wise Nestor. He said that all those who could no longer bear the humiliation and abuse of the Spartans fled to this mountain. I would find this mountain, I decided. I had keen eyes and strong legs. Once I reached Ithome, I would bring my mother and sisters there. I would show all the helots the way to freedom. The night seemed to last forever, but finally, dawn broke over the distant hills. The old man and I walked together for a while along the dusty road, two unlikely companions bound together by a shared understanding that the world could be different than it was. The song had called us forward, toward an uncertain but hopeful future. I parted from the blind singer at the crossroads, where the path to Ithome branched off from the main road. He pressed his gnarled hand to my forehead in blessing and whispered words in an ancient dialect that I did not understand but felt in my bones. Then he continued on his way, his staff tapping out a rhythm that seemed to match the meter of his heroic songs. I stood at the crossroads for a long time, looking back toward my village. Smoke was beginning to rise from the cooking fires as my mother and sisters prepared the morning meal. They would discover my absence soon enough, and my mother would weep, but I hoped that someday she would understand why I had to leave. I hoped that when I returned, for I was determined to return, I would bring with me the knowledge and strength to free them all. The path to Ithome led through wild country that few helots ever saw. For the first time in my life, I walked on ground that no Spartan overseer had ever trod, breathed air that carried no scent of subjugation. The hills rose around me like sleeping giants, covered in dark pine forests that whispered secrets in the wind. Eagles soared overhead, their cries echoing off the rocky crags like the war cries of ancient heroes. As I climbed higher into the mountains, I began to encounter others making the same journey. There was Lycus, a blacksmith whose son had been killed in the previous year's crypteia. His massive hands, scarred from years of working hot iron, shook with barely contained rage as he told me his story. There was Melissa, a young woman whose husband had been dragged away in the middle of the night, leaving her alone with two small children. She had left them with her sister and sworn to find a way to bring them to safety. We traveled together for a while, sharing what little food we had and taking comfort in each other's presence. None of us had ever ventured so far from our homes before, and the wildness of the mountains both frightened and exhilarated us. Every twisted tree seemed to hold ancient magic. Every stream we crossed sang with the voices of nymphs and water spirits our grandmothers had told us about in whispered stories. On the second day of our journey, we saw it, Mount Ithome, rising before us like a promise made manifest. Its peak was shrouded in clouds, and its slopes were dark, with forests that seemed to stretch up toward the heavens themselves. Ancient legends said that Zeus himself had been hidden on this mountain as an infant, protected from his father Cronus, who would have devoured him. Now it would protect us as we learned to become something more than slaves. The path wound steeply upward through increasingly dense forest. The air grew thinner and colder as we climbed, and we wrapped our thin cloaks more tightly around our shoulders. But with each step, I felt a growing sense of liberation, as if I were climbing out of a deep well toward the light above. Near the summit, we encountered the first of the free helots, men and women who had made this journey before us, and established a hidden community in the mountain's embrace. They were led by a man named Aristomenes, who would later become famous throughout all of Greece for his resistance to Spartan tyranny. But when I first met him, he was simply a tall, bearded man with eyes that burned like coals, and a voice that could inspire courage in the most timid heart. Aristomenes welcomed us to their camp with words that I will never forget. "You are no longer helots," he said. "You are free Messenians, descendants of heroes, and this mountain is your home until we can reclaim all the lands that were stolen from our ancestors." The camp was larger than I had expected, with several hundred men, women, and children, living in rough shelters built into the mountain's natural caves and overhangs. They had carved terraces into the steep slopes where they grew barley and beans, and they kept goats and sheep that grazed on the high meadows. Most importantly, they had weapons, bronze spears and swords that gleamed in the mountain sunlight, shields emblazoned with the ancient symbols of Messenia. For the first time in my life, I saw helots, no, Messenians, standing tall with dignity and purpose. The men practiced with their weapons daily, their movements fluid and deadly. The women tended crops and prepared food, but they also learned to fight, understanding that freedom required everyone to be ready to defend it. Even the children played games that taught them the skills they would need as warriors and leaders. Life on Mount Ithome was unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first 14 years of my existence, every moment of every day had been shaped by the knowledge that I was a helot, a slave, property of the Spartan state. I had never made a decision that was truly my own, never spoken words that might not bring punishment, never allowed myself to dream of a different future. Now, suddenly, I was free to choose how to spend my days. The first few weeks were almost overwhelming. I would wake in my small cave dwelling and lie there for long minutes, waiting for someone to tell me what tasks I must perform. But no overseer's voice called out commands. No Spartan master arrived to assign me work. The silence was both terrifying and wonderful. Aristomenes must have recognized the confusion that many of us new arrivals felt, because he took special care to help us understand what freedom meant. "You have spent your lives being told what to do," he explained to a group of us one morning as we sat in a circle around a small fire. "Now you must learn to tell yourselves what to do. Freedom is not the absence of work or responsibility. It is the ability to choose your work and accept responsibility for your choices." I chose to learn the art of war. Every morning before dawn, I joined the other young men on a level area near the camp center where we practiced with spear and sword. My first weapon was a bronze-pointed spear that had belonged to a Spartan warrior, one of several that Aristomenes and his men had taken in a successful raid on a patrol. The wood of the shaft was smooth from years of use, and when I first hefted it in my hands, I felt a thrill that ran from my palms up through my arms and into my heart. Learning to fight was harder than I had expected. My body, shaped by years of farm work, was strong but not balanced in the way that combat required. I could swing a scythe all day without tiring, but holding a spear in proper fighting stance for even a few minutes left my arms aching and my shoulders burning. My feet, accustomed to the soft earth of plowed fields, stumbled on the rocky ground as I tried to master the complex dance of advance and retreat that warfare demanded. But gradually, day by day, I began to improve. My stance became more solid, my movements more fluid. The spear began to feel less like an awkward burden and more like an extension of my own body. Most importantly, I began to understand that learning to fight was about more than just wielding weapons. It was about believing that I had the right to defend myself and those I cared about. It was about refusing to be a victim. In the afternoons, when the heat made weapons practice impossible, we studied other skills that free people needed. An old priest named Diocles, who had fled to the mountain after the Spartans destroyed his temple, taught us to read and write. These skills had been forbidden to helots, but here on Ithome, they were considered essential for anyone who hoped to help lead the struggle for Messenian independence. I discovered that I had a talent for letters. The shapes of the alphabet seemed to come naturally to my mind. and soon I was copying out passages from ancient texts that Diocles had smuggled away from his temple. I learned about the great lawgiver Lycurgus, who had organized Spartan society, and about Solon of Athens, who was said to be a wise reformer. I read accounts of battles fought by our ancestors and poems that celebrated the beauty of our homeland. But the most important lessons I learned on Mount Ithome had nothing to do with weapons or letters. They were lessons about what it meant to live as part of a community of free people. Every major decision that affected the camp was made in assembly, with every adult man and woman having the right to speak and vote. Disputes were settled by judges, chosen from among the most respected members of the community, not by the arbitrary will of Spartan masters. I watched in amazement as former helots transformed into citizens. Lycus, the blacksmith, whose rage had burned so hot when I first met him, learned to channel his anger into productive work, forging weapons and tools for the community. Melissa, who had fled to the mountains to escape the fate of her husband, became one of our most effective scouts, her knowledge of the lowland villages proving invaluable for planning raids and rescues. Most remarkably, I watched myself change. The frightened boy who had hidden under mats while his father was dragged away was becoming a young man who could stand before the assembly and argue for a particular course of action. The muscles I had developed wielding farming tools were now shaped by weapons training into the physique of a warrior. The mind that had been kept deliberately ignorant was expanding to encompass new ideas and possibilities. But freedom, I learned, was not without its costs. Life on Mount Ithome was hard in ways that my previous existence as a helot had never been. In the village below, I had been guaranteed food and shelter, even if both were meager and came at the price of my dignity. Here on the mountain, we had to create everything we needed through our own efforts. Winter was the cruelest teacher. The first winter I spent on Ithome nearly broke my spirit. Snow fell early and deep, blocking the paths that connected our camp to the outside world. Our stores of grain ran low, and we were forced to subsist on thin gruel and whatever game our hunters could bring down in the frozen forests. Many nights I went to sleep with my belly cramping from hunger, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake in leaving my village. The cold was even worse than the hunger. Our rough shelters, carved into the mountainside, provided protection from wind and snow, but they could not keep out the bitter chill that seemed to seep into our very bones. We huddled around small fires, burning precious wood that had to be gathered from increasingly distant stands of trees. I spent hours each day helping to cut and carry firewood, my hands so numb from cold that I could barely grip the tools. Several of our people died that first winter. Old Diocles, the priest who had taught me to read, succumbed to a fever that his aged body could not fight off. 2 of the small children in our camp froze to death despite all our efforts to keep them warm. We buried them in shallow graves scraped from the frozen earth, and Aristomenes spoke words over their bodies that honored their sacrifice for the cause of freedom. But spring came eventually, as it always does, and with it came a renewed sense of hope and purpose. The snow melted, revealing new growth sprouting from the mountain soil. Our hunters brought back fat deer and wild boar from the awakening forests. Most importantly, new refugees arrived from the lowlands, bringing news of increased Spartan oppression and their own stories of awakening to the possibility of freedom. Among these new arrivals was my cousin Nicomedes, a young man about my own age whose father was my father's younger brother. He had made the dangerous journey to Ithome after witnessing the latest round of Crypteia killings in our village. 3 more young men had been murdered by roving bands of Spartan youths, their bodies left in the fields as a warning to others who might think of resistance. Nicomedes brought devastating news about my family. My mother had fallen ill shortly after my departure, weakened by worry and the additional burden of trying to manage our small farm without help. My youngest sister had been forced to work in the fields normally assigned to men, and the constant exposure to sun and wind had left her thin and worn beyond her years. Worst of all, Spartan officials had visited our hut several times, asking questions about my disappearance and threatening punishment for anyone who might be helping runaway helots. The news filled me with guilt and anguish. By choosing freedom for myself, I had brought additional suffering to those I loved most. I wanted to abandon everything and return to help them, but Aristomenes counseled patience. Your mother and sisters need more than just your presence, he told me. They need the hope that you represent. If you return now, untrained and alone, you will accomplish nothing except adding your name to the list of the dead. But if you complete your training and help us build our strength, you may someday return as part of a force strong enough to free them all. So I stayed and continued to train, though every day brought fresh worry about my family's welfare. I threw myself into weapons practice with renewed intensity, pushing my body beyond its limits in preparation for the battles that I knew must come. I studied the arts of war with the same dedication I had once applied to farming, learning tactics and strategy from Aristomenes and the other experienced fighters in our group. My first real taste of combat came in the second spring of my time on Mount Ithome. Aristomenes had been planning a raid on a Spartan outpost in the valley below, a small fortress that controlled a crucial pass through the mountains. The outpost was lightly held, perhaps 20 Spartan warriors and a handful of helot servants, but it represented an important symbol of Spartan control over Messenian territory. I volunteered eagerly for the raid, despite having never participated in actual combat before. Aristomenes was reluctant to include untested fighters in such a dangerous mission, but our numbers were still small, and every capable warrior was needed. After much discussion, he agreed to let me join the assault force, but only if I promised to follow orders exactly, and not attempt any heroics that might endanger my comrades. We left the mountain camp before dawn on a moonless night, moving in single file down narrow paths that only our scouts knew. There were 30 of us in total, a mix of experienced fighters who had been with Aristomenes for years, and newer recruits like myself who were eager to prove their worth. We moved in complete silence, communicating through hand signals that we had practiced until they became second nature. The approach to the fortress took most of the night. We had to circle wide around several Spartan patrols, hiding in olive groves and rocky gullies, while armed men passed within yards of our hiding places. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly that I was certain the enemy must hear it. But somehow we remained undetected. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we reached our positions around the fortress. It was a simple structure, stone walls surrounding a central courtyard, with a single tower that served as both lookout post and armory. Smoke was beginning to rise from cooking fires within the walls, as the garrison prepared for another routine day of occupation duty. Aristomenes had divided us into 3 groups. The largest group, led by himself, would assault the main gate. A smaller force would scale the walls on the fortress's blind side and attack from within. The third group, which included myself, was assigned to prevent any enemy soldiers from escaping to raise the alarm at larger Spartan installations. The attack began with a shower of arrows from our hidden archers. The Spartan sentries on the walls cried out in surprise and pain as bronze-pointed shafts found their marks. Before they could organize a proper defense, Aristomenes and his men were at the gate, using iron bars to pry apart the heavy wooden beams that secured it. What followed was a chaos of shouting voices, clashing bronze, and the wet sounds of blades striking flesh. I had imagined that I would feel fear in my first battle, but instead I felt a strange sense of clarity and purpose. When a Spartan warrior broke through our lines and tried to flee toward the valley below, I pursued him without hesitation, my spear lowered and ready. He was older than me and more experienced, but also wounded and panicked. When he turned to face me, I could see blood streaming from a gash on his forehead and terror in his eyes. For a moment, we stood facing each other in the morning light, the free Messenian and the Spartan oppressor, representatives of 2 peoples whose hatred for each other had been building for generations. Then he attacked, and instinct took over. All the hours of training on the mountain paid off as I parried his initial thrust and responded with a quick counterattack that opened a long cut along his sword arm. He dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, raising his hands in surrender. I stood over him with my spear pointed at his throat, breathing heavily from the exertion of combat. This man was my enemy, a representative of the system that had enslaved my people and murdered my father. I had every right to kill him, and everyone would have understood if I had. But looking down at his frightened face, I found I could not do it. He was just a man, probably not much older than myself, who had been born into a system He had not chosen any more than I had chosen to be born a helot. "Go," I told him, stepping back and lowering my spear. "Go back to your masters and tell them that Messenia is not dead. Tell them that we will never stop fighting until every helot is free." He stared at me in amazement for a moment, then scrambled to his feet and ran toward the valley, clutching his wounded arm. I watched him disappear into the morning mist, wondering if I had made the right choice, or simply shown weakness that would bring greater suffering to my people. The raid on the fortress was a complete success from a military standpoint. We captured significant stores of weapons and supplies, freed a dozen helots who had been held as prisoners, and demonstrated that Spartan power was not invincible. Most importantly, word of our victory spread quickly throughout the region, inspiring other communities of helots to begin organizing their own resistance efforts. But success came at a price. Within days of our attack, Spartan reprisals began. Patrols of red-cloaked warriors swept through every helot village in the area, conducting brutal interrogations and executions. Anyone suspected of having connections to the mountain rebels was killed on the spot. Entire families were wiped out on the basis of nothing more than rumor and suspicion. The worst news came from my home village. The Spartans had arrived there 3 days after our raid, convinced that the proximity to Mount Ithome made it a hotbed of revolutionary activity. They had killed every adult male in the village, more than 40 men, including several who were so old and frail that they could barely walk, let alone pose any threat to Spartan rule. Among the dead was my uncle, Nicomedes' father, who had been tortured before his execution in an attempt to force him to reveal information about rebel activities. He had died without saying a word, protecting secrets he did not possess with his silence. His wife and daughters had been sold to slave traders from distant cities, scattered to the far corners of the Mediterranean world, where they would never again see their homeland. When Nicomedes learned of his father's fate, he wept openly for 3 days and nights. Then his grief transformed into a cold, implacable rage that frightened even his closest friends. He volunteered for every dangerous mission, seeking opportunities to kill Spartans with a single-minded intensity that worried our leaders. Aristomenes tried to counsel him about the dangers of fighting from anger rather than principle, but Nicomedes would not listen. I felt responsible for all this suffering. My decision to join the rebels had brought death and destruction to innocent people who had never chosen to be part of our struggle. The faces of the dead haunted my dreams, and I began to question whether the cause of freedom was worth such a terrible price. These doubts came to a head one evening when I was standing guard duty on one of the mountain paths. The sun had set hours earlier, and the only light came from the stars scattered across the clear mountain sky. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of fires from helot villages in the valley below, communities that lived in constant fear of Spartan reprisals for crimes they had never committed. As I stood there wrestling with my conscience, I heard footsteps on the path below. I called out the challenge that all guards were required to give, and was relieved to hear Aristomenes' voice responding with the correct password. He climbed up to join me at my post, settling down on a nearby boulder with the casual ease of a man who had spent most of his adult life in the wilderness. "You look troubled, young Procol," he said, studying my face in the starlight. "Are you having second thoughts about our cause?" I found myself pouring out all my doubts and fears. My guilt about the villagers who had died because of our actions, my worry about my family's safety, my uncertainty about whether violent resistance was the right path to freedom. Aristomenes listened without interruption, occasionally nodding to show that he understood what I was saying. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, gazing out over the valley where our people lived in bondage. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years of struggle and loss. "I have felt every doubt that troubles you now," he said. "I have wept for every innocent person who has died because of actions I ordered or supported. I have wondered if we are helping our people or simply making their suffering worse. These doubts are not signs of weakness, Procol. They are signs that you still have a conscience, that you understand the true cost of what we are trying to achieve." He turned to face me directly, his eyes reflecting the starlight like dark pools. "But I have also seen what happens to a people who accept slavery without resistance. I have watched proud Messenians become broken, defeated creatures who pass their bondage on to their children like a hereditary disease. I have seen entire communities forget that they were once free, until slavery becomes not just their condition, but their identity. In my 3rd year on Mount Ithome, an unexpected visitor arrived who would change the course of my life and understanding. It was late autumn, and the first snows were beginning to dust the higher peaks when our sentries reported a lone traveler climbing the mountain paths. This was unusual enough to warrant investigation, since most people had learned to avoid the region due to the constant warfare between rebels and Spartan forces. The traveler turned out to be an elderly Athenian named Xenophanes, a philosopher and poet who had been wandering throughout Greece for many years. He was thin and frail, with a white beard that reached nearly to his knees and eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of decades. What brought him to our remote stronghold was a letter from the blind singer who had first awakened my understanding of our heritage. The old man had somehow learned of our community and recommended us to his friend as people worth teaching. Xenophanes carried with him a small but precious collection of scrolls containing the works of various poets and thinkers. More importantly, he brought something that none of us had ever experienced before: formal education in the traditions of Greek culture and philosophy. Under his guidance, I began to understand that the struggle for Messenian freedom was part of a much larger conversation about justice, governance, and the proper relationship between individuals and their communities. The old philosopher established what he called a school in one of the larger caves near our camp center. Every evening after the day's military training and work were complete, anyone who wished to learn could gather there to hear him speak about the great questions that occupied the minds of thinking people throughout the Greek world. What is justice? How should free people govern themselves? What obligations do we have to future generations? I became one of his most devoted students, spending every spare moment listening to his lectures or copying out passages from his scrolls. Through his teachings, I learned about the reforms of Solon in Athens, who had freed debt slaves and established laws that protected common citizens from the arbitrary power of aristocrats. I read about the constitutions of various city-states and began to understand the different ways that human societies could organize themselves. But perhaps most importantly, Xenophanes helped me understand that our struggle against Spartan oppression was not unique. Throughout history and across the Greek world, people had faced similar choices between freedom and slavery, justice and tyranny. Some had chosen to resist, while others had accepted their fate. The outcomes had varied widely, but the fundamental moral questions remained the same. You must understand, he told our small group of students one evening, that you are not fighting merely for the right to be left alone by Sparta. You are fighting for the right to determine your own destiny as a people. This means that you must think carefully about what kind of society you want to create once you achieve your freedom. This was a new idea for most of us. We had been so focused on the immediate goal of ending Spartan rule that we had given little thought to what would come after victory. But Xenophanes challenged us to think beyond mere revenge or the simple restoration of some imagined golden age. He wanted us to envision a new kind of Messenian society, one that would be worthy of the sacrifices being made to achieve it. Under his guidance, we began to debate questions that had never occurred to us before. Should freed helots have the same political rights as those who had never been enslaved? How should we treat Spartans who fell into our hands? What economic system would best serve a free Messenia? These discussions often continued long into the night, growing heated as different viewpoints clashed and evolved. I found myself particularly drawn to questions about education and culture. My own transformation from an ignorant farm boy to someone capable of reading and writing had shown me the power of knowledge to change lives. I began to dream of a Messenia where every child, regardless of their parents' social status, would have access to learning. This vision went far beyond anything that existed even in the most advanced Greek cities, but Xenophanes encouraged me to think boldly. Great changes in human affairs, he reminded me, always begin with someone imagining something that has never existed before. As my 4th year on Mount Ithome began, our small band of rebels had grown into something resembling a real army. Word of Aristomenes' victories had spread throughout the Peloponnese, inspiring helot communities across the region to rise up against their Spartan masters. What had begun as isolated acts of resistance had evolved into a coordinated campaign that posed a genuine threat to Spartan power. But success brought new challenges. Our forces now numbered in the thousands, requiring complex logistics and organization that tested our leadership's abilities. Food supplies that had been adequate for a few hundred mountain fighters were insufficient for a proper army. Weapons and equipment had to be manufactured or captured in much larger quantities. Most difficult of all, the diverse groups that had joined our cause often had conflicting ideas about strategy and objectives. Some of the newer arrivals were motivated primarily by desire for revenge against specific Spartans who had wronged them. They pushed for immediate attacks on major Spartan strongholds, regardless of the tactical situation or the likely casualties. Others, particularly those from the most impoverished helot communities, seemed more interested in looting and pillaging than in the broader goal of Messenian independence. Managing these different factions while maintaining military discipline required skills that few of us possessed. I found myself increasingly involved in these organizational challenges. My literacy and education under Xenophanes had made me valuable as administrator and planner. Aristomenes began assigning me to work with newly arrived rebel groups, helping to integrate them into our overall command structure and ensuring that they understood our rules of conduct. This work was often frustrating, but it gave me insights into the complexities of leadership that my earlier focus on individual training had not provided. One of the most difficult situations arose when a group of helot rebels from the coastal regions arrived with nearly 100 escaped slaves of various nationalities. These men and women had fled their masters when word of our uprising reached their communities, and they looked to us for protection and leadership. But many of them spoke no Greek, and their presence complicated our relationships with some helot communities that viewed foreign slaves as competitors for scarce resources. The question of what to do with these refugees led to heated debates among our leadership. Some argued that we should welcome anyone willing to fight against Sparta, regardless of their origins. Others maintained that our struggle was specifically for Messenian freedom, and that accepting foreign fighters would dilute our cause and confuse our objectives. Still others worried about the practical problems of feeding and equipping people who had no knowledge of local conditions or established loyalties to our cause. After much discussion, we decided to accept anyone willing to take an oath of allegiance to Messenian independence and to abide by our rules of conduct. This decision proved wise in many ways, as several of the foreign fighters brought valuable skills to our forces. A group of Syrian metalworkers helped us establish better weapons production. A former Egyptian scribe taught our record keepers more efficient methods of tracking supplies and personnel. Most remarkably, a Scythian archer named Anacharsis became one of our most effective military trainers, teaching our fighters techniques that proved crucial in later battles. But the growth of our forces also made us a more attractive target for Spartan military action. No longer could they dismiss us as a minor irritant that could be dealt with through routine patrols and reprisals. King Anaxandridas himself took personal command of the campaign against us, bringing with him the largest Spartan army that had been assembled in living memory. The first major battle of this new phase of the war took place in late summer, on a plain near the ancient ruins of Sthenoclaris. Aristomenes had positioned our forces on high ground overlooking the battlefield, hoping to negate the Spartans' advantages in traditional heavy infantry combat. Our plan was to use missile weapons and mobility to wear down their forces before engaging in hand-to-hand fighting. I had participated in numerous raids and skirmishes during my years with the rebels, but the Battle of Sthenoclaris was my first experience of large-scale warfare. Nothing in my training had prepared me for the reality of facing thousands of Spartan warriors arranged in their famous phalanx formation, their bronze-pointed spears glinting in the morning sun like a forest of deadly metal. Our position on the hillside gave us a commanding view of the entire battlefield. I could see the Spartan forces deploying in perfect order, rank upon rank of identically equipped hoplites, their red cloaks and polished bronze creating an almost hypnotic pattern of color and light. Behind them marched units of Perioeci, the free but subordinate peoples who served as auxiliary troops in Spartan armies. On the flanks, cavalry units prepared to sweep around our positions and attack from the rear. Aristomenes moved among our forces, offering words of encouragement and final instructions. When he reached the section of the line where I was positioned, he clasped my shoulder with his strong hand and looked directly into my eyes. "Today we fight not just for ourselves," he said, "but for every helot child who deserves to grow up free." Remember your training, trust your comrades, and know that our cause is just." The battle began with a shower of arrows and javelins from both sides. Our position on the hillside made us difficult targets for the Spartan missile weapons, while our own archers and slingers were able to inflict significant casualties on the densely packed enemy formations. For perhaps an hour, the two armies exchanged projectiles, while the Spartans slowly advanced up the slope toward our positions. But eventually, as we had known it must, the moment came for close combat. The Spartan phalanx reached the base of our hill and began its methodical climb toward our defensive lines. I could hear their war cries growing louder as they approached, not the wild shouts of barbarian warriors, but the disciplined, rhythmic chanting that marked them as the most professional soldiers in the Greek world. When they finally reached our lines, the impact was like an earthquake. The crash of bronze against bronze, the splintering of wooden spear shafts, and the cries of wounded men created a cacophony that seemed to fill the entire world. I found myself pressed shoulder to shoulder with my comrades, thrusting my spear at red-cloaked figures who appeared and disappeared in the swirling confusion of combat. The fighting was more exhausting than I had expected. Each thrust of my spear required enormous effort, and parrying enemy attacks sent shocks up through my arms and shoulders that left my muscles burning. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and making it difficult to see clearly. The bronze blade of my spear became slippery with blood. Whether my own or that of my enemies, I could not tell. Gradually, despite our advantageous position and fierce resistance, the superior discipline and equipment of the Spartan forces began to tell. Their phalanx formation, perfected through generations of warfare, proved more effective than our more improvised defensive arrangements. Sections of our line began to bend backward under the relentless pressure of their advance. It was then that Aristomenes made a decision that probably saved our army from complete destruction. Rather than allowing our forces to be gradually overwhelmed in a grinding battle of attrition, he ordered a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions further up the mountain. This maneuver required tremendous discipline and coordination, since any disorder in our ranks would have given the Spartans the opportunity to turn our retreat into a rout. I found myself part of the rearguard action that covered our army's withdrawal. This was perhaps the most dangerous and demanding fighting of the entire battle, as we had to hold our positions just long enough for the main force to disengage, then fall back ourselves without being overwhelmed by pursuing enemies. Several times I thought we would be overrun, but somehow our small group of volunteers managed to maintain our formation and execute our retreat in good order. The Battle of Sthenoclaris was technically a defeat for our forces. We had been driven from the field and forced to abandon our planned defensive positions, but in many ways, it represented a kind of victory. We had faced the full might of the Spartan army and survived as an organized fighting force. Our casualties, while significant, were far lighter than they would have been if we had attempted to match the Spartans in traditional hoplite warfare. Most importantly, we had demonstrated to ourselves and to the wider Greek world that helot rebels could stand against their former masters in open battle. But the human cost of our resistance was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Among the dead at Sthenoclaris was Lycus the blacksmith, who had joined our cause after his son was killed in the Crypteia. He died as he had lived, with fierce courage and uncompromising determination, leading a counterattack that allowed dozens of his comrades to escape encirclement. We found his body surrounded by fallen Spartans, his massive smith's hammer still clutched in his hands. Melissa, the young woman who had become one of our most effective scouts, was wounded in the leg by a Spartan javelin during our retreat. The injury became infected despite all our efforts to treat it, and she died in agony several days after the battle. Her last words were instructions for messages to be sent to her children, whom she had not seen since fleeing to the mountains years earlier. Perhaps hardest of all to accept was the death of my cousin Nicomedes. His hunger for revenge against the Spartans had finally overcome his caution and discipline. During the most intense phase of the fighting, he had broken from our formation to pursue a Spartan officer who reminded him of the men who had killed his father. The pursuit led him into the middle of an enemy unit, where he was quickly overwhelmed and cut down. We recovered his body after the battle, but the sight of his young face frozen in an expression of rage and pain haunted me for months afterward. Each loss diminished not just our military capabilities but our sense of purpose and hope. These were not anonymous soldiers dying for abstract principles. They were friends, family members, and comrades whose individual stories had become intertwined with my own. Their deaths forced me to confront questions about the ultimate meaning and value of our struggle that I had previously been able to avoid. In the weeks following the battle, as our forces regrouped in more remote mountain strongholds, I found myself spending long hours with Xenophanes, seeking wisdom that might help me make sense of so much suffering. The old philosopher listened patiently to my doubts and fears, offering insights that gradually helped me understand that the moral complexity of our situation was not a weakness, but a sign of our humanity. War, he told me one evening as we sat by a small fire, is the most terrible of human activities because it forces good people to do terrible things for necessary reasons. The tragedy is not that you feel guilt about the deaths your choices have caused. The tragedy would be if you did not feel such guilt. The moment we stop mourning our enemies as well as our friends, we become the very monsters we are fighting against. His words helped me understand that the pain I felt was not something to be overcome or dismissed, but rather something to be carried and honored. The dead, whether friend or foe, deserve to be remembered not just as casualties in a political struggle, but as individuals whose lives had value independent of any cause they served. This realization led me to begin keeping a written record of our struggle, documenting not just the major battles and strategic decisions, but the personal stories of the people whose lives were shaped by our choices. I wrote about Lycus and his fierce love for his dead son, about Melissa and her sacrifice for children she might never see again, about Nicomedes and his self-destructive quest for vengeance. I hoped that someday, when the fighting was over, these individual stories would help future generations understand the true cost of the freedom they inherited. As our 4th year of organized resistance drew to a close, an unexpected opportunity arose that would ultimately lead to the most significant phase of my personal journey. A merchant ship from Athens, blown off course by autumn storms, put in at a small harbor on the Messenian coast. The captain, a man named Cleisthenes, was sympathetic to our cause and agreed to carry messages between our forces and potential allies in other Greek cities. Through this connection, we learned of the remarkable reforms that had recently been implemented in Athens by the lawgiver Solon. According to the reports that reached us, Solon had managed to address many of the same problems of debt, slavery, and social inequality that plagued helot communities throughout the Peloponnese. More intriguingly, he had accomplished these changes through legal and political means, rather than through violent revolution. Aristomenes decided that we needed to learn more about these Athenian developments, both to see if they offered any models that might be applicable to our own situation, and to explore the possibility of gaining Athenian support for Messenian independence. When he asked for volunteers for a dangerous mission to Athens, I immediately stepped forward. The journey to Athens was my first time leaving the Peloponnese, and my first real experience of the wider Greek world beyond the narrow confines of Spartan-controlled territories. Traveling in disguise as a trader's assistant, I made my way north through territories controlled by various city-states and tribal groups, each with their own customs and political arrangements. What struck me most forcefully was the diversity of ways that Greek communities had organized themselves. Some, like Sparta, were rigidly hierarchical societies where a small warrior elite dominated large populations of subordinated peoples. Others, like many of the smaller cities I passed through, seemed to operate as loose confederations of extended families, with decision-making shared among household heads, according to ancient traditions. But Athens was different from anything I had encountered. Even before I reached the city itself, I could sense that this was a place where new ideas about human social organization were being tested. The roads leading to the city were crowded with travelers from throughout the Mediterranean world. Merchants, scholars, craftsmen, and diplomats who had come to participate in what seemed to be an ongoing experiment in collective governance. The city itself was larger and more complex than I had imagined possible. Sparta, which had seemed impressively substantial when I first visited it as a boy, was revealed to be little more than a large village by comparison. Athens sprawled across several hills and valleys, with different districts devoted to various activities: markets, workshops, temples, and residential areas that housed people from every level of society. But what impressed me most was not the city's size, but the quality of public discourse I encountered there. In the agora, the central marketplace. Citizens gathered daily to debate questions of policy and governance, with a sophistication and openness that would have been unthinkable in any Spartan-controlled territory. People who disagreed with each other fundamentally could argue their positions without fear of persecution, confident that their ideas would be judged on their merits, rather than on the social status of their advocates. Through my merchant contact, I was eventually able to arrange a meeting with Solon himself. The great lawgiver received me in his modest home near the Acropolis, in a simple room lined with scrolls and writing materials. He was older than I had expected, nearly 70 years of age, but his eyes remained sharp and alert, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. I had prepared carefully for this meeting, thinking through the questions I wanted to ask and the information I hoped to obtain. But Solon immediately disarmed me with his directness and genuine interest in our Messenian struggle. Rather than treating me as a curiosity or potential source of intelligence, he spoke to me as one person seriously engaged with questions of justice speaking to another. "Tell me about your people," he said simply. "Not about your military situation or your political objectives, but about the daily realities of helot life. How does a system of slavery affect not just those who are enslaved, but the entire society that depends on such a system?" His question revealed a depth of understanding that surprised me. Most Greeks I had encountered, even those sympathetic to our cause, tended to view the helot system as primarily a Messenian problem, an unfortunate situation that was regrettable, but not directly relevant to their own communities. Solon clearly understood that slavery corrupted both the enslaved and the enslavers, creating social and moral problems that extended far beyond the immediate relationships between masters and bondsmen. I found myself telling him, not just about the obvious brutalities of helot existence, the arbitrary killings, the economic exploitation, the denial of basic human dignity, but about the more subtle ways that systematic oppression had damaged Messenian society. I described how the constant fear of Spartan reprisals had made it difficult for helot communities to develop trust and cooperation among themselves. I explained how the prohibition on education and cultural expression had gradually eroded our people's sense of their own history and potential. Solon listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed his grasp of the broader implications of what I was describing. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, apparently lost in thought. "You understand," he finally said, "that what you are describing is not unique to Messenia. Every Greek city-state struggles with questions about how to organize society in ways that promote both individual flourishing and collective prosperity. The specific forms that injustice takes may vary, but the underlying tensions between different groups' interests are universal." He went on to describe the situation that had existed in Athens before his reforms. While Athenian citizens had never been subjected to the kind of systematic enslavement that characterized the helot system, many had fallen into debt bondage that was almost equally degrading. Powerful aristocrats had accumulated vast estates while ordinary farmers lost their lands and were forced into quasi-servitude. Social tensions had reached the point where civil war seemed inevitable. The challenge, Solon explained, was to find reforms that would address legitimate grievances without simply replacing one form of injustice with another. The poor wanted their debts canceled and lands redistributed. The wealthy wanted to maintain their property rights and social privileges. Both sides expected me to choose between them, but I realized that lasting solutions required finding ways to meet the legitimate needs of all parties. He described the specific measures he had implemented: the cancellation of existing debts, the prohibition on debt slavery, the establishment of legal protections for ordinary citizens, and the creation of political institutions that gave non-aristocrats a voice in governance. But he also emphasized the limitations of what legal reforms alone could accomplish. Laws can establish frameworks for justice, he told me, but they cannot create the moral character and civic commitment that make just societies possible. That requires education, cultural development, and gradual changes in how people understand their relationships with each other. My stay in Athens lasted nearly 3 months, during which I absorbed as much as possible about Athenian institutions and methods of governance. I attended sessions of the Popular Assembly, where citizens debated policy questions with a level of sophistication that amazed me. I visited law courts where disputes were resolved through reasoned argument rather than arbitrary authority. I spent hours in workshops and markets, observing how economic relationships functioned in a society where most participants were free rather than enslaved. But perhaps most valuable was the time I spent with other visitors to Athens who had come from various parts of the Greek world. Through conversations with merchants, scholars, and diplomats, I began to understand that the questions we faced in Messenia were part of broader transformations taking place throughout the Mediterranean world. Traditional forms of social organization based on kinship and inherited status were everywhere being challenged by new ideas about individual merit and collective decision-making. When the time came for me to return to Messenia, Solon provided me with letters of introduction to sympathetic contacts in other cities, as well as copies of some of his legal codes that might serve as models for our own future governance. More importantly, he gave me a framework for thinking about the long-term goals of our struggle that went beyond mere resistance to Spartan rule. Freedom, he reminded me in our final conversation, is not simply the absence of external constraints. True freedom requires the development of institutions and cultural practices that allow people to govern themselves wisely and justly. Your military struggle against Sparta is necessary, but it is only the first step toward creating a society worthy of the sacrifices being made to achieve it. The journey back to Messenia took several weeks, as I traveled carefully to avoid Spartan patrols and checkpoints. I used this time to reflect on everything I had learned, and to consider how Athenian experiences might be adapted to our very different circumstances. The Athenian reforms had been implemented through existing political institutions, with the consent of established authorities. Our situation required the complete overthrow of an oppressive system and the creation of entirely new forms of governance. But the underlying principles that Solon had articulated, the importance of balancing different groups' legitimate interests, the need for legal frameworks that protected individual rights while promoting collective welfare, the recognition that lasting change required cultural as well as political transformation, seemed relevant regardless of the specific mechanisms through which they were implemented. As I made my way through the familiar mountains of the Peloponnese, I found myself seeing the landscape with new eyes. These hills and valleys, which had always been simply the geographical setting for our struggle against Spartan oppression, now appeared to me as the potential foundation for a new kind of human community. If we could succeed in driving out our oppressors, we would have the opportunity to create something genuinely unprecedented, a society based on principles of justice and equality that had never been fully tested in the real world. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me, and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. When I finally returned to our mountain strongholds, I found that the situation had changed dramatically in my absence. The Spartan response to our continued resistance had become increasingly brutal, with entire helot communities being destroyed in reprisal for rebel activities. But this escalation of violence had also triggered a corresponding expansion of our support base, as previously neutral populations concluded that passive acceptance of Spartan rule offered no protection from arbitrary persecution. Our forces now numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn from throughout the Peloponnese and including significant numbers of free Greeks who had become convinced that Spartan hegemony threatened their own independence. This growth in our capabilities had allowed Aristomenes to shift from defensive guerrilla tactics to more ambitious offensive operations, including successful attacks on major Spartan strongholds. But success had also brought new challenges and divisions within our ranks. The diverse groups that now comprised our coalition had different ideas about war aims and post-war governance. Some wanted simply to restore the status quo that had existed before Spartan conquest, with traditional aristocratic families resuming their ancestral roles. Others pushed for more radical changes that would eliminate not just Spartan rule but all forms of hereditary privilege. My experiences in Athens made me particularly sensitive to these internal tensions, and I found myself increasingly involved in efforts to develop a coherent political program that could unite our various factions around common goals. Drawing on Solon's example, I argued for reforms that would address the legitimate grievances of all parties, while avoiding the extremes of either reactionary restoration or revolutionary chaos. This work was more difficult and frustrating than I had anticipated. Military campaigns, for all their dangers and uncertainties, had clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Political negotiations required patience, compromise, and the ability to find common ground among people whose fundamental interests seemed incompatible. Many of our fighters, who had demonstrated remarkable courage in battle, proved surprisingly resistant to the idea that former enemies might be incorporated into a new Messenian polity, rather than simply eliminated or expelled. The debates that took place in our war councils often reminded me of the discussions I had witnessed in the Athenian assembly, but with crucial differences. The Athenians I had observed were arguing about how to modify existing institutions and practices. We were trying to imagine entirely new forms of social organization, while simultaneously conducting a life-or-death military struggle. The pressures of war made it difficult to engage in the kind of patient deliberation that complex political questions required. Despite these challenges, we gradually developed what amounted to a constitutional framework for a liberated Messenia. The document we produced was influenced by Athenian models but adapted to our specific circumstances and values. It provided for a system of representative government based on geographically defined districts, with leadership positions filled through election rather than inheritance or appointment. Most importantly, it explicitly prohibited slavery and established legal protections for individual rights that would prevent the re-establishment of helot-like conditions under any future government.